Good afternoon. It's Lee McClure, cybersecurity instructor for WazU. Welcome to the first part of a new Network Foundations course that's beginning, and welcome back to our reentry student in this course. We have a new format we've been switching to from the older 24 to 33 weeks. So we have 3 weeks per course. And so I'm redoing all these videos in that model. And so we're going to cover the first 3 lessons from the 10 lessons of the class today. And we will actually, over the next 3 weeks, we will cover 3 of them, each week, and of course we'll actually add on the final project as well into the last week. Though I've made the due dates in the system for the class, the first 3 lessons are due the first week, then 4 of them are due in the second week, and then the final week only has 3, including the final project. But that's a really heavily weighted assignment in this course, the final project, so you got to get to that. And so anyway, that's kind of why I've kind of front loaded that. But it's also, there's only so many lessons of new material because the final project kind of brings it all together, as well as to a degree lesson 9, bringing all the technology together. So anyway, let's begin. So lesson 1 for this course is introduction. This Network Foundations class has kind of 2 purposes in our program. One is it sort of level sets everybody, even though we need some computing and networking background to join the program. We want to make sure everybody has all the basics, and we particularly want to emphasize it from a Linux point of view because many of our students coming in come from a Windows world more often than not. And so we introduce a lot of those concepts in this course, review some basic networking, but show you how to do it on the Linux side of things. And then, we make sure we have that basic knowledge down. In addition, a big part of this course is actually sort of getting set up and used to and working with the tools that we're going to use quite extensively throughout the rest of the program. And these really come down to VirtualBox and GNS3. And VirtualBox is a virtualization software package that allows us to basically run a virtual computer on our own computer. And we will run multiple of these throughout the program. You'll build a number in this class and then use some pre-built ones later in the program. And then GNS3 is the graphic network simulator, though it's really an emulator. And you'll play with that and do some basic things, get the basics of that down. And then we will use some provided topologies later in other courses throughout the program. So this is a kind of a little bit of review of networking, a focus on learning Linux and learning our new tools that we're going to use. In most cases, no one yet has come into the program with already pre-existing GNS3 experience. So that's what we're going to focus on in lesson 1, is getting all this set up and understanding how this technology works. And so to just talk a little bit about that, the first piece of software that's kind of the critical linchpin is VirtualBox. And so I'm going to go into a screen share here, and we will take a look at, minimize and get some stuff out of my way. Excuse me 1 second while I try to move this. There we go. So this is the VirtualBox, virtualbox.org. It is an open source software package that's actually managed through Oracle. Oracle Database Corporation and Business Enterprise Solutions Corporation, and but they manage a number of the open source projects like MySQL and VirtualBox, etc. There are other solutions, virtual VMware from VMplayer, VMware, vSphere, all the products that come from VMware, which is basically a Dell-owned company now, are definitely usable. And you could technically even do the course with them if that's what you're comfortable with, but then things won't match as you follow along. And the reason we chose VirtualBox is because VirtualBox is free on all platforms. You can run VirtualBox on a Linux machine, you can run VirtualBox on a Mac, you can run VirtualBox on Windows machines, and you get the same kind of experience across all of those platforms. And so that's why we want you to use VirtualBox. It's what we're going to use exclusively throughout the program. VirtualBox, as I said, is basically a Windows program or a Mac program or a Linux program, however you want, whichever version you ultimately get, that allows you to run other virtual computers. And so you might be having, like I'm on a Windows machine here, obviously, and I can run other Windows computers, I can run Linux computers, I can run any kind of computer I want to run, in effect, through VirtualBox, and I'll show you some of that here as we go on. But let's just go through in lesson 1 sort of the basics of Okay, so what are we setting up here? Well, you're going to come over to virtualbox.org, and I would assume, given that this just changed not too long ago, that the numbering may be off. It may say 5.1 or a different version. And of course, don't worry about that. We'll get that tweaked as we continue to evolve and refine stuff moving forward. But you're going to click on this download VirtualBox and come to the VirtualBox page. And you'll notice it has Windows host. So in other words, if your PC is a Windows machine, you're going to want to click and download this one, which is the VirtualBox 5222. You can see it down at the bottom a little bit there, I think, in my status area. Or if you're on a Mac OS X, you can get that version. You can get Linux versions, even a Solaris version, which is another project they control. Now, it's not mentioned or required for this class, and if you don't do it, that's fine, because when you need it later, we'll take you through it. But technically, while you're here, if you go ahead and download whichever version of VirtualBox you need and put it into, to install it, then you can also download this extension pack. We don't need it for this class, but it will be needed later in one of the later classes in the program. So while you're here, you can go ahead and download it and install it too. These are pretty simple installs. They'll come up and ask you to save the file, etc. You would then, that'll be in your downloads folder, and you'll run the executable or run the package on Mac and run the install. And then what you'll have is, of course, you'll have a program on your icon. You have a desktop icon for Oracle VM VirtualBox. And if I launch that real fast here, you will see that what it looks like. Now, I have a bunch of stuff already set up. Yours will come up empty. You won't have any of these VMs over here on the left-hand side. And as you can see, I have an older version that's asking me to update. I'm not going to bother with that right now. So you're going to have an empty area, but these are the VMs. Actually, you're going to end up having all of these over the course of the program. But the first one is the GNS3 VM, because when we run the GNS3 to do virtual networks, it actually uses Oracle VirtualBox in the background. And this is not going to be the first time I say this, but I always just make a real emphatic point that when the way we've set these courses in this program up, we will almost always be using VirtualBox. Now, the question is whether we're using VirtualBox to run the GNS3 VM and we're really using GNS3, or are we just using VirtualBox to run standalone virtual machines? But never the twain shall meet. So you'll almost always, if you're working in hands-on labs, whether with virtual machines or virtual networks, you'll have VirtualBox running, but you don't need to have a bunch of standalone VMs if you're in the GNS3 exercise. And as a matter of fact, these things can get pretty intensive to run multiple virtual machines or to run a virtual network. So you don't want to necessarily, unless you just have the greatest system, you don't want to necessarily run all this at one time. And so you'll either be using VirtualBox to run the GNS3 VM and thus the GNS3 software, or none of that will be running, and instead you'll just use VirtualBox to run other VMs like Kali and other ones we're going to play with, but I don't want to overly complicate that. You're going to make some yourself, so this will all become much clearer. Once you get it installed, you'll have VirtualBox installed. If you did go ahead and download the extension pack, you can double click on it and it'll install into VirtualBox at that point, and you'll be good to go. And like I said, this whole area over here where I have all these choices, you won't have anything in here at all. So, but as long as you have the software installed and running, then you're ready to begin. Now, the next step is that you need to set up GNS3. So you have to come over here to gns3.com. And you'll see that, you can kind of see in the background that it shows these routers connected together. It's kind of grayed out. We'll get plenty of examples of this too. When you want to download it, what you have to do is click on that button. It's going to make you create an account. You can use any email, username. I already have one, so I'm just going to log into mine so that I can show you folks what the download screens look like. You need to download. And so once you, I was going to say, don't tell me that. There we go. So once you do create your account or log in, whichever the case is, then you're presented with, just like we had with VirtualBox, you're presented with options to download the software for Windows, for Mac, or Linux. And then if you look, though, there's actually two things we have to get from here, and this is required. So if you're on a Windows machine, you're going to download the Windows GNS3 software, Mac software, or Linux software. But then it says for optimal performance, make sure you download the GNS3 VM as well. And when you click on that, that takes you to a different page, and you'll see it has different VMs that are available for use. We're going to get the VirtualBox one because that's what we just set up. And so what happens is you're going to end up downloading VirtualBox, and installing it. And then you're going to download the GNS3 software, and you're going to download this GNS3 virtual machine. Okay. Then you want to download both of those. And then once you have all of them, just like any other download, it pops up, a standard screen. Do you want to save the file? You'll see it's GNS3 VM VirtualBox 2.1 zip. So you'll have to unzip that. And inside of there will be a .ova file, which is an open format for virtual machines, open virtual machine architecture, and it'll allow you to import that in. And so here's what we do. Once you, like I said, you download VirtualBox first and install it, get it up and running. Then you download the GNS3 software and download the GNS3 VM. You unzip the GNS3 VM. And then what you do is literally you come here inside of VirtualBox, you see this choice on the file menu, File, Import Appliance. And then you'll navigate out to wherever that might be on your system, probably your downloads folder where you downloaded it. Didn't download it because it would take too long for our short video demo here, but you would pick that GNS3 VM, the .ova file, and then it will import into VirtualBox, and you will finally have a GNS3 VM. And you'll have your first virtual. It's really just an Ubuntu Linux. We'll learn all about that a lot in this class. It's a Ubuntu Linux virtual machine, so it's a virtual computer. And I'm going to fire it up independently. As a matter of fact, you don't have to do this as part of the install, because once you get this imported, then you can set up the GNS3 software and sync them together. But I actually like to go ahead and just fire it up, because you can see many times you won't. It'll happen automatically for you when you're using GNS3. But the thing that you're wanting to do is to just see how it fires up. So it launches this virtual computer. You can see it starts to look for various hard drives, found a virtual drive. It boots up. This is the splash screen, just like any other computer splash screen. And then in this case, because it's a custom VM for GNS3, it's going to come up with the GNS3 splash screen, which is their little lizard icon with its tongue sticking out, kind of giving you an indicator that it's progressing. When we get it to fully come up here in a bit, it'll take just a second, especially since I'm streaming class and all this. It will show us that splash screen, and then show us a screen that tells us what IP address it's been assigned. So here's the splash screen here in the GNS3 VM. You don't actually have to do anything with this one per se, 99% of the time. It just sits back here in the background, and the GNS3 software itself talks to it and creates its virtual networks inside of it. And it's really kind of running virtual computers inside of virtual computers, but don't let that confuse you. So you can tell it's Ubuntu 14, it tells you what version of GNS3 it is, and it tells me what IP address here, 192.168.56.101. And I got my mouse captured. Let me get that out of there. And so that's all. Now we have the GNS3 VM. Now, if you have any issues at this point, it doesn't want to work, throws an error of some kind, obviously reach out to me. I'll help you get that fixed, because it's really critical we get this set up running. Once you get all this running, then it generally will just run with a few little caveats here and there. So I'm just going to minimize this out of the way now. And then once you've installed the GNS3 software, you'll have another icon here. In this case, the GNS3 little gecko or lizard. So I'm going to launch GNS3. Now, I'm likely going to get an error message, and I'm hoping I do, actually, because it's one thing that happens fairly often with GNS3 is that it wants to know what IP address of your real network card. And of course, if you're like most people, and my laptop's no different, when it when you reboot and get a patch, or the router reboots, you'll get a different IP address, and then it's going to sometimes will throw a fit that it can't connect to your network card. And you'll have to go into and that's exactly what I'm getting. See, it says I couldn't bind to 192.168.101.122. So that was my IP address last time I used GNS3. And so as such, it wants to come up to this open screen, but I'm going to cancel out of that because I have to fix this IP error. And this is actually a step of, I don't want to do the update in this case again. So, but this is kind of what it looks like, except that we're not working yet. GNS3 is not connected. We're not connecting to the servers. So one of the things I'll show you, if you don't already know this trick on Windows, it's ipconfig. And you can look at and find all the IP addresses assigned to your machine. So we have some host-only adapters. That's a VirtualBox stuff. Here's an Ethernet adapter that is part of VMware. I have both on here, so don't let that confuse you. I'm looking for my wireless adapter. Here we go. So this is my, I'm one off. I'm 121 this time. So you find your real IP address, and you need to know this when you install DNS3, or if this error ever comes up when you launch it again later. And what you do is, in the install process, it's going to ask you to set up what's called the host binding, which is basically connecting to your local network. If you, once you've got it set up, then it'll connect and everything works until your IP changes. And if you ever run into this error, all you have to do is go to Edit Preferences and then click on the server choice, and you'll see that it's just fell back to the local host. But I just got to drop this down and find that IP, the 121 that I know is my IP that I'm getting on Wi-Fi right now. Once I do that, hit enter to accept it. What's going to happen is GNS3 is going to go, oh, okay, now I can bind to that address, and then it's going to talk locally through the virtual network and connect to that GNS3 VM in the background. And then we'll see that stuff starts to pop. So now it's connected to my local. My laptop is called Hydra. And then the GNS3 VM, it says it's starting. It's actually just connecting to it because we know we started it ourselves back here in the background, right? So it's sitting there. There we go. So this is what you're looking for when you finally get GNS3 installed. It'll come up, and you should have these green indicators saying that your local computer, in other words, GNS3 is talking to your local network card. And then through that, in the virtual adapter that VirtualBox provides, it's talking to that GNS3 VM. So now we can do things. Now we can begin to play around. And actually, once you've, when you, well, that's the open. I was trying to get that screen of being able to make a new one is like, sorry, this. So this is what it'll usually come up to, and ideally, especially after the first install, you won't get an error because you'll pick your current IP. You might have that happen later. And then you can just type in something. So we'll call this Net Foundations 33, just to make it different, since this is the 33-week program. And once I create it, boom, we have this environment now that we can work with. GNS3 allows us to do all kinds of cool things. We can simulate and emulate routers and servers. And if I come over here, these are some of the choices, like there's routers, there's switches, there's end user devices. I generally just come down here and click the browse all devices. When you first install GNS3, it's going to be set to installed and available devices, which you can see there will be a lot of devices that are grayed out. We're not going to use the vast majority of these, to be honest. We're going to use certain ones that we've picked to the program, and you'll be exposed to those throughout the course and then the rest of the program. But technically, these are devices. A lot of them are open source and free. There are some, especially when you get down here into the Cisco stuff. We can't use those because Cisco doesn't provide any free licenses or any educational discounts or anything like that. And so we don't use Cisco, but if you ever in the future go to work for a company and they have Cisco equipment and you want to sort of build a simulation of your own network, you can literally add Cisco routers into here, because you can take the image from that router and load it in here, and you're running a virtual copy of that router. But you have to have the licensing. So we're not going to be playing with Cisco or Juniper. We're going to be playing with one way down here in the bottom, called VYOS, which is a router that, there it is, VYOS, that is an open source router and actually runs at the command line, very similar to Cisco. It was pretty much kind of an open source clone in a way. I guess that's not quite fair. They did their own thing, but it's very similar to how you work with Cisco or Juniper routers and equipment at the command line. It has its own command line, and you'll learn this. So you'll be learning things that are very similar. We're just using an open source version, so there's no cost involved. And in addition to actually installing VirtualBox, then importing the GNSN3 VM, and then installing GNS3, you're going to be given some instructions on how to, play around with that some more and add some additional stuff. And ultimately, we'll begin to do things like, once you've got certain things imported, you'll go through some of those steps. We can begin to build a virtual network. And so we could theoretically, I'm just picking some that I already have here. So you can see it's just drag and drop. Once you've got things installed, we'll take you through the rest of that in the course. Then we can turn on this little cabling thing and say, let's connect this port to this port. And let's connect this port to this port. And then of course we could go in and actually start working on it. And this will be what you do in this class. You're going to work with standalone virtual machines, and then you're going to work with GNS3 to build virtual networks. and you'll have to configure these devices. You can see they're all, the connections are all red because none of them are on yet. And even if we booted all this up, since this router is not configured, it, you know, we wouldn't be able to just ping through it. But once we set things up, then it will work. Now, I will point out one thing here. It's mentioned in the bottom of the announcements of the class. The VYOS router, as the courseware describes, and it even says right here, it says at first boot, boot the router, you'll be starting from a virtual CD-ROM, because this is a virtual machine. And so it says type install system. That installs it to its virtual hard drive, and then you can use it like a real router at that point. It'll remember its settings and everything else. But that's actually kind of a lengthy process to go through that install. So one of the things I did to help speed things up, you'll find a link for it at the bottom of the announcements, is there's a starter project that I created that just has a bunch of routers setting in there that have already had that install step done. And so actually you can, when you're working on one of the later assignments, you know, you can open that project, do a save as, and then work with those and start setting them up without having to do that install system step. But once we've done that, then we can make these machines ping each other, you know, just as it flows in. I'm going to go ahead and start one of these and show you how that works. So I can just right click and start it. And when I then bring up the right click again and tell console on it, what it does is it launches basically PuTTY, and it gives me a prompt, and I'm root on this machine. And it's a Linux box, so I can type commands, take a look at things, and see that there's, you know, folders, and we're going to take you through that in the coming lessons. So, but the first lesson is all about getting set up, and it's really critical. So like I said, the steps are pretty simple. Download VirtualBox, install VirtualBox, then download the GNS3 software and the GNS3 virtual machine and get them on your machine. Then import the virtual machine into VirtualBox, and then do the install for GNS3. And we take you through this in the lesson. I'm just kind of highlighting it here. And that way, then you should have everything up and running, and you can begin to play along. So that's lesson one, effectively, is all about getting installed and set up. And then lesson two, which I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on, except I'm going to hit a couple quick pieces, including bringing up this graphic. Lesson two is sort of the, okay, now that we've got you set up in the first lesson with the tools you need, now we want to just do a quick little, like I said, level setting, review, recap of basic networking. Make sure everybody's on the same page. And then as well begin to talk about how things get done a little bit more focused on Linux, especially as we move into lesson three. One of the really critical things we talk about in lesson two that I feel is important enough, and I just, you know, got this from one of the open source sites out there, but we talk about what's called the OSI model. The OSI model, if you're not familiar with it, is a representation of how networking works. It breaks it into layers. And you can see there are 7 layers of the OSI model, starting at the very bottom with the physical layer. So this is like the plug, you know, the cable connecting into, this is the physical media, you know, your network card, your cabling, stuff like that. And so, and that even includes your Wi-Fi antenna, because basically a Wi-Fi antenna is just a virtual network connection to a Wi-Fi adapter, right? So at the end of the day, however you're getting that basic physical connectivity, whether that's sending pulses over a wire or sending radio pulses over the, you know, over the antenna and the wireless, then that's what we're talking about. The base level is the physical level. Then once we're connected physically, how do we pass information around the network? Like if we just plug 2 computers together with a crossover cable, or 2 computers together with a hub, how can they communicate? Well, at the data link level, that's where we get MAC addresses, the unique address of every network adapter. And that becomes the physical addressing, and the frames is what they're called, or of data is passed around. And then as you keep moving up, you actually get into the network layer. Well, in our world, I mean, there's other protocols out there, and they're talked a little bit about in the lesson, but for the most part, and what we care about in this modern world is TCP/IP, right? Transmission Control Protocol, Internet Protocol. The IP part handles the IP addressing, and it maps IPs to the MAC, etc. And so the IP is here, like you see it right here, logical addressing. So my machine, like we saw earlier, has 192.168.101.121 is its IP address, and that, of course, that network card has its own MAC address. And in my case, it's a wireless adapter. So my wireless is physical. My wireless network card has a MAC address. That's then my machine has been assigned through DHCP and IP address. And then end-to-end communications and reliability is handled by TCP, part of the protocol. Transmission Control Protocol makes sure that when we send a packet, it actually gets there. And if not, the recipient can request a resend. And so the TCP part is going on. And then when you come up here into these other host layers, we're talking about the data. The session might be cookie information, other information that's maintaining a session, say like logging into a website or having a client server application run. The presentation of how that data is encrypted, like SSL or whatever. And then of course at the very top, what kind of protocol is up here? Well, it could be HTTP, HTTPS, it could be FTP, it could be some other protocol unique to that client server application. And so it's very important to understand this conceptual model of how networking works, because one, for just troubleshooting reasons, you know, like I can't ping, I'm not getting the internet. Well, where is that happening? Or I can't get this website to come up. Why is that happening? Well, is it because the web server's down and it's up here at this level? Or is it because my networking's down, my wireless is down? Where is it? The other part is because that there are different ways, as you're going to learn throughout this course, to attack things at different levels of this. So, you know, we can attack a network by physically tapping into it. We can spoof IP addresses or MAC addresses, or we can do what's called ARP poisoning, and you'll learn about this all later. At the network level, we can obviously spoof IPs or capture packets and do things at this level. We might do man in the middle here. Maybe we break into the encryption up here. Maybe we break into the website at this level, at the top level. So as you know, we as security people need to understand this model, because we're going to have to defend against potentially attacks at different layers of the model. And we're going to have to be monitoring and logging and keeping eyes on all this different stuff. In addition, of course, we talk about IP4 versus IP6. We're going to mainly use IP4 in the class. IP6 comes, you know, is becoming is the next thing. It's live, but you know, many people still use IP4, even if nothing else at your home, because you know most people are like I am, behind a firewall, and you have a router from your ISP, your internet provider. And when you connect your machines, whether Wi-Fi or through cable, they boot up, they use DHCP to basically, you know, the dynamic host configuration protocol to get an IP address, and it's going to be a 192.168 something address. And then they use, you know, your router to get out to the internet and share your one real IP address. IP6 is coming and is online and will be rolled out more and more, because we've pretty much run out of IP4 addresses, but that's not going anywhere anytime soon. And it still is sort of the backbone of everything. IP6 is being added on to give us a lot more addresses, especially as we look forward to a world where more and more things are going to be connected to the internet. And we'll talk more about that later in other classes when we talk about Internet of Things. And then there's a lot of discussion about protocols. What kind of protocol? At the base level, lower levels, we have like IP and TCP that provide, you know, they operate here at levels 3 and 4. But all kinds of other protocols operate up in the application layer, you know, whether that's email, SMTP, POP, IMAP, those are email protocols. We have HTTP, HTTPS. We, of course, if we wanted a remote session on a machine, we could use the old Telnet. As we'll learn in this program, you're not going to use that very often because it's not secure, so you're going to use Secure Shell instead. You got FTP or Secure Copy. We have all kinds of protocols that we talk about. And like I said, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on lesson 2 because it's mainly a review, but I did want to point out the OSI model is one that if you haven't really got that one down, it's time to start memorizing it and learning it. Heck, to be honest, I've had people ask that question like as a technical interview question. So do you understand networking? Okay, so what's the OSI model and how does that work and how do you use it and what value is it and what are the 7 layers? I mean, so it's a test question on Network Plus kind of thing. It's a test question and no doubt one of our quizzes and et cetera. So then if we talk in lesson 3, we start talking about working with the server. What you're going to do in lesson 3 is actually create your first virtual machine. And you're going to basically download a CD image, a DVD image, an installer image from Ubuntu, which is the version of Linux we primarily use, but we use a lot of Kali and some other flavors along the way too. But in this course, we're going to stick to Ubuntu for the most part. And so you're going to basically create your own virtual machine. You're going to have, if you're on a PC or a Mac, you're going to be running a Linux computer on that machine. And so this will allow you to then have a tool and an environment to play with to begin learning some of the basic Linux commands. And so basically in lesson 3, it's called working with the server. That's the main focus of the that lesson. Now, since I'm already got GNS3 up and running and I only have so much more time here in this session today, what I'm going to do is actually just return to this screen, which is a connection, a PuTTY connection, a shell connection to one of those virtual Ubuntu clients that's on GNS3. The reality is I'm using this one, but they're kind of the same. You're going to create one that's standalone on your own computer. You won't be using GNS3 and Lesson 3. You'll just be using VirtualBox to make an Ubuntu VM, and then you'll boot it up. You'll log into it. You'll learn how to connect to it with PuTTY and shit or terminal on your Mac or your command prompt on Linux if you happen to be using that. And so, and if you don't have any experience with Linux, which most of our students have, then this is a very critical lesson to kind of play with, get yourself all set up, and then you can begin to play with some of the commands. So I'm going to give you a quick tour of Linux real fast and hit a few commands along the way. Many of the commands, this is if you've never worked even at say like the DOS or PowerShell command line on Windows, then this may be completely new. And I know a lot of students have had some issues with sort of adapting from the GUI world to having to do things at the command line. But let me just explain a few things. The way, in general, the way Linux commands, and for that matter, any commands, whether it's a Mac, which really is Unix underneath, but we'll get to that later, or a Windows box, when you bring up, like I did here, I brought up this, PowerShell, I mean, just this DOS command prompt, basically, so I could run ipconfig and find my IP address. Well, what if I want to find my IP address on Linux? Well, it's ifconfig is the only difference. But when I type that command, it'll come back and tell me that my local adapter has an IP6 address that was automatically assigned, but it doesn't have an IP4 address. I'm not seeing a 192 or whatever the case may be. You're going to learn in this lesson and the next lesson how to set IPs for Linux. And there's a couple different ways that can be done. You'll be taken through all of that in the lessons. But as you can see, generally speaking, you just type a command. So there's, in many cases, the commands are very similar. So it was IP, what happened to my screen? Oh, there we go. So it was ipconfig on Windows, but it's ifconfig on Mac or Linux to find out what IP addresses are assigned to that machine. If you just have a command like that, it's just type the command and hit enter, and it comes back with information. But of course, many commands, while you can do that, they actually have more power. There's other options you can pass in. We call them parameters. And so, for example, like if I use the ls command, then I'm going to just type clear to clear my screen. Ls is the list command, and on Windows, I mean on Linux or Mac, on a PC, if you were trying to see what files, you would just type dir and hit enter. And now since I'm in my home directory here, I see a bunch of like my downloads, my folders, etc. Right? So, but when I typed it here, I didn't see anything. Well, why is that? Well, because I'm in the root user's home directory on Linux, and there's nothing on this machine. There's nothing in it. But there are, instead of just typing ls, I can add some additional information. So you see what I've done is I've typed ls, which is the command to list, just like dir on Windows. Then a space, and then I use the hyphen or the dash, and I'm putting in some additional letters, in this case, LA. These letters allow me to say I want ls to do more than just the default listing. I want it to give me some more information. And actually, this is generally almost the way I run ls most of the time, because the L stands for long listing, and the A basically gives you the access to hidden files, as they're called. And so if I now hit enter with this command, so ls by itself said there was nothing in this folder. But ls space hyphen LA says, oh, look, here's a couple files. Well, that's a trick. In Windows, if you want to make something hidden, you right click and you tell it that's a hit. You change its property to be a hidden file. In Linux, Mac, Android, if you want to make a file hidden, you just give it a period to start its name. So this bash rc, this GNS3, this profile, these are all .bash rc, .profile. And so normally when I do, even if I did just a ls-l, I still says no files because they're hidden files. Now, there's a cool trick, and this actually works across all command lines. But if I want to repeat a command, all I have to do is hit the up arrow a couple times to go back through the previous things I've done. And I can even modify that if I wanted to and change it and then hit enter. So you don't always have to retype this over and over. And many times if we're repeating commands, we're running the same kind of commands, just making a slight variant, then the easiest thing to do is just to hit the, or you make a mistake. Like if I did hyphen, I don't even know, maybe that'll work. Yeah, so that was a valid, I'm trying to get something that won't. Let's pick something weird. All right, everything's working. Ooh, that should have thrown an error with that slash, funny enough. So I'm not finding any information here, but like I said, all I have to do to get it, I can just edit, hit the up arrow, go back and edit and run the command. Now, the other thing you can do is that in addition to, let's try this one. Okay, so this time, instead of passing in with the hyphen in some additional parameters, I want to say, I don't want to just look right here. I would like to look somewhere else. I want to look at the root of the file system, which is represented by just the slash on Linux, but it's sort of the same slash you see on the URL. That's how I kind of remember it. And then, of course, if we go back over here to the command line then we know that we're using the other slash for. And so, like, if we wanted to do the same thing here, we would do this slash. And now that's giving me the top level of the tree. See, I'm getting things like Dell program files. I actually got output from a different place without having to move there. And I can do the same thing here. Now, when I run that, you'll see that just ls by itself just lists all the names. So those are all the folders that are off the root of this server. But if I wanted to combine that, I could say -ls la. Now you'll notice what I've done. And this is kind of what I'm trying to get to. Generally, this is the format. You will have the command, whatever the command is, ls, ifconfig, etc. On and on, all these commands you'll learn. Then there'll be a space. And then if you're passing in any parameters, you'll usually have letters or hyphen letters. So this part right here is the parameters or options that I'm passing in to the ls command. And then there's another space. And then there is the target or the destination. So there's kind of, and so we basically have command, space, options, space, whatever we're doing. Is it a target? Are we moving the file here? Are we deleting a file, putting in a file name because we want to delete that file, etc. So the thing is that sometimes students will do stuff like this, where they'll forget these spaces. And then what we're going to get is bad command or file name. And it's just the spacing. It's got to be command, space, options, space, whatever we're looking for. And so we could even do something like, we saw one of those folders, okay, the bin folder. So let's do the bin folder. And now we see all these files in here, right? And so the idea, I'm going to go back to just doing the root. And you can see I'm just up arrowing them up. So now, there we go. We can see just the root folder. So there is one hidden file off the root that we didn't see when we just typed ls. It didn't show right here, right? Just those folders showed. And as you play around, you'll get more and more comfortable with this. But then there's all this information. Like I said, if you just do ls/, you get just the names. If you do ls/ or hyphen la for the long listing, and then tell it to do it, you get, instead of just this short list of names, sometimes that's useful. You're just looking for a file name. But most of the time, I like the -l because I want to see, and the a, because I want to see any hidden files. What if an attacker left a hidden file on my system? I would like to find that, right? So I generally kind of just look with that model all the time. And then the other thing I want is all this other information. All this information here. What is all this information? Well, this is really critical information. You will notice that there is this series of letters and hyphens. And that is actually really what this is. This is the permissions of the file or folder. The first space is usually going to be a D if it's a directory, a folder, or it's going to be a / if it's a file. Like that's a file. It's a hidden file, .docker environment, docker env. The rest of these are all Ds, right? But then after that, you'll see that after you skip the first character, the next 9 characters, if I can get them to select correctly, come on, this picky mouse. There we go. The next 9 spots are actually the permissions of that file. And you'll notice that it's like read rwx, r whatever, r-rx. What that stands for is read, write, and execute permissions. And that there's 3 groups of those. And so the first group, the first 3 here, the read, write, execute, it goes with the owner of the file. So that's what this other information is. It tells me that this file is owned by the root user. And then it also shows me the group. So the group in this case is the next 3. These right, oh, I got one too many. That was close. It's really hard to select. So those 3 slots actually go with the group. And you notice that there is a different group. So like the staff, there's a different group here. And this is one of the ways, like many times when I set up a web server, I will create a web dev group or something like that. And the people who need to edit the web pages, I'll put them in that group and I'll set the permissions so that the group has read, write, execute permissions so they can do their job modifying things. But obviously we don't want everybody to build and modify stuff. So a lot of stuff is owned by root. And then if you end it, as you're going to do in the standalone VM, when you create users, you'll get your own home folder and it'll be owned by you. And and obviously you don't want everybody to be able to look into your personal folder. But this is all about permissions. And then the last three, read, write, execute, they refer to everybody else, what we call the other group. So right now, as you can see, the vast majority of these files are read, write, execute for root, which root's the super user. It's like administrator on Windows. And then the group, which is usually root, but we do have a staff group in here too. But all the groups have been assigned read and execute. In other words, the group can't change anything, only root can. At least from, but we can read and run those programs. And then everybody else also generally has the read and execute permission so that they can run the programs that are on the system. Now notice this folder. This folder right here is different. It's a folder, it's called root. Well, that's the root user's home folder, that one we were in a minute ago. And you notice that we don't want anybody to be able to read that except for the root user. And so that it has dash, 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 dash. And so if you wanted to lock down a folder to just your user, then when you create a folder, you could change the permissions. And we'll take you through that in a lesson. To kind of get an idea, the hierarchy on Linux is different. On Windows, you usually have like a C colon, and then underneath that you would see, program files and Windows and all those folders that, that you have. And in the case of Linux, we just have the slash as the top. That represents the top. That's equivalent to like C colon backslash, but instead it's just the representation. And then everything is off of that. And so we have, you can see there's the bin folder, the boot folder, the dev folder, the etc folder, GNS3 folders, which are tied to the fact you won't see those on your standalone VM because you're not in GNS3, but the GNS3 environments, they'll be there. But you will see the other ones like home and lab64, media, root. Underneath the home folder is where individual user accounts get created, their own personal folders there. And so how do we move around this structure? Well, basically we use the CD command. If you type CD all by itself, which really didn't do any good because I'm still sitting in the root folder, you can see here that it tells me where I am. It says I'm the root user on Ubuntu, and it shows me this little tilde sign, which is to the left of your number 1. The tilde represents your home directory. So I'm already in my home directory, so that, and matter of fact, there's another command called pwd, present working directory. And when I type that, it tells me, oh, you're in /root. So you're in the root directory. Okay, cool. So let's change. Okay, once again, here we go. We have command space. Where do we want to go? Well, I want to go to root. And now you'll see my prompt changes to show me that I'm in the root folder. So now if I type ls, I get the root stuff. And I don't have to put I'm here. By default, commands work in the folder you're in. So if you're in the root folder and you type ls, you get a listing of that. But if I want to get a listing of something else, then I can type the additional information like we've shown. So like we can look inside the bin folder. We're in the root folder, but I can tell it I want to look down in bin, and here's all these different programs that are within bin. One of the things to notice, funny enough, and it's just the way Linux works, is that here is the actual program ls. That's in the bin folder. So when we're typing ls, we're running that program. If I type LSL, it's going to come back and say no command because there is no program in here called LSL. There is an LS and an LS block and other make directory and all more and all kinds of move and remove and other programs. You'll learn about some of these as we go on. But nonetheless, that's what's happening. The default path is to look in bin, and it's where the binary files, the executable files are on Linux. It's kind of equivalent to program files in a way, kind of. So, like I said, you'll get used to this as you play with it more. But like I said, if you issue a command without giving it any destination, any target, then that command's gonna operate in the folder you're in. So if I just type ls and I'm in the root folder, I get that information. If I type ls and I say I want to do bin, then I get the information from there. And of course I can dig down. But if I want to change, I can change to bin. All right, so now I'm in bin and I can just do ls and I get that information. But if I want to look back up a notch, I can either use the shortcut 2 dots or I can use the slash, and now I'm looking back at root. all commands in Linux and the command prompts of even Windows and otherwise, they work the same way. It's command space option space action or target or destination. And so you're going to be playing with basic commands. You're going to create some users. You're going to be playing with the VIM text editor. Vim is a text editor. Oh, it doesn't exist on this one. Okay, so I'm going to use Nano instead. So Nano is a text editor I can use. You can use it if you will. I don't care which one. The courseware all talks about VIM, but you just need to be able to edit files on the computer sometimes. And particularly as we get later in the program, you're going to have to edit configuration files and stuff like that. So whichever of the editors, the VIM is taught in the lesson, and it's good to know the basics of it. But then Nano is actually kind of easier to use in all honesty. But you're just running a program. You're going to basically learn how to create new users with the user add functionality so you can create another account. You're going to learn about how to more about permissions and about VM. And then as we go into next week, for next week, when we cover a handful of lessons, we're going to spend more time learning some more commands and setting up information on Linux, how to set up the IPs on Linux next week. And then after a couple of lessons playing with standalone VMs, we're going to shut them down. And we're going to dive into GNS3 next week. And we're going to learn about the virtual router, BYOS. And we're going to learn about some switching, how to set up VLANs and stuff like that. And then learn more about routing and then firewalls. So we'll be working with GNS3 more in the later part of the courses coming up. And so that's what I have for you today. I went a little long, but I've showed some demos. I'm going to close some of this out, stop my share. Hopefully that has given you a quick enough overview and a little bit of it so you know what to look for, what you're expecting. So like I said, as a quick recap, lesson 1 is the most important. If you haven't already started, get going because you got assignments due technically tonight. The first lesson, you should have that first install done, if not already by tonight. That way you can be on point pace and continue to work into the remaining lessons for the end of the week. But you want to download the VirtualBox installer, potentially the extension pack, but that's optional. Install it and make sure it runs. Okay, cool. We got VirtualBox. Then go to GNS3, download the GNS3 software and the GNS3 VM. Unzip the GNS3 VM and import it, file import appliance, into VirtualBox. Then you'll have your first virtual machine there. And then you can do the install of the GNS3 software itself. And it's going to ask you a few questions along the way. Most things are default, but the two that really matter are, it's going to ask you what virtualization are you using, and you're going to switch it to VirtualBox because that's what we're using. And then it should be able to ultimately find that VirtualBox machine that's imported in. And it's going to ask you, even before that, it's going to ask you to pick your IP address, your host binding, as you call it. So make sure you know what IP address your computer is currently assigned and set that up. And when you do that, then it's going to come up and those little green lights will light up. You'll have your VM and your local server running, and you'll have GNS3 installed. And that is pretty much the first lesson, is getting VirtualBox, GNS3 set up and running, and you know you got it working and you can do things. And lesson 2, quick overview of networking stuff, pretty straightforward. And then lesson 3, you're going to build your first virtual machine. We will not be in GNS3. You can shut that down and just have VirtualBox running, and you'll follow the instructions, download the Ubuntu installer, tell VirtualBox you're creating a new virtual computer, run the install, and it'll boot up, and you'll log in, and you'll have a new virtual computer that you can play with. And you'll start to do some of the stuff I was doing in GNS3 through that Ubuntu appliance there. Very similar. Like that one didn't have VIM. Yours will, because you'll be building a standalone one. And then you'll be playing with commands, learning about permissions. And then as we go into the next week, like I said, the fourth lesson as well is also continuing to play with these standalone Ubuntu VMs, learning more about ping and traceroute and all these different commands that we can use to do networking, and how to set up it, and use ifconfig, and how to set up the IP addresses so that you can configure them. And all this stuff you're learning in that virtual machine works just as well in the virtual machines that are inside. I mean, it works the same. Linux is Linux. The different flavors sometimes out there are different, but if you're working, how we teach you to set up the IP for Ubuntu standalone virtual machine is exactly the same way you can do it inside of GNS3, those virtual machines. And then after we get through lessons, so next week we'll finish up with the Linux sort of overview and working with those standalone virtual machines, and we'll get into begin to switch over into the GNS3 part of the course. and spend a number of lessons on GNS3's virtual router and virtual switches and routing protocols and stuff like that. And then the last week we'll talk about firewalls and packet filtering and all that good stuff, and you'll be playing with that some. And then really lesson 9 is kind of a capstone assignment, with lesson 10 being your final project. And so I'm going to actually kind of split this 3, 3, and 3 kind of, if you will, as we go forward. So anyway, you're re-entering students, so you know how this works. I'll get this downloaded, processed, posted into the LMS. You can take a look at that. If you have any questions, reach out to me on Slack, and I hope you have a good day. See you next time.